So today, the path of cooperation in the spiritual life, cooperative work with humans, living and dead. And what I mean specifically by living humans in this sense are the people who are left behind when someone dies, and also before someone dies, that person obviously is still living, and how do we involve ourselves cooperatively with them in the process of their making their transition to the other side. Now, this is something of a specialty for seers who have the capacity to do astral travel, and also for empaths because of their deep level of feeling. Okay, so in the beginning, I'll be talking about the stages of cooperative work, and from my perspective, and because I've prepared the slides for you in connection with the theme, this will apply to any kind of cooperative work. So first I go over what we mean by cooperative work, and then I'll apply it directly to the topic of this morning. So when we want to work cooperatively with other beings, what we want to do at first is declare our intention to be of service. And I say to all beings, human, non-human, physical or non-physical, even though we might have a specialization or we might have a special desire to work in a particular way, the idea is to be as open as possible. And then whatever we're ready for can show up as an opportunity for us to be of service. Then there's usually an element of self-preparation involved. So we have to study something about the field that we're going to be of service in. And that includes the aspect of beings and their needs that I was talking about as important for not only the people on the empath path, but for everybody. So once we've studied the field, we need to think about striving for unity consciousness in thought, feeling, speech, and action. That's a theme that has been present throughout our talks this week. And then also the idea of climbing the ladder of oneness. What this involves is we have to learn to identify our own true needs before it becomes possible to sense the true needs of other beings. At some point, intuitive perception will probably develop. As I mentioned yesterday, we can often do this in conjunction with plants, animals, children, and the people that we deeply love. And that needs to be understood as a baseline for any kind of work that we do beyond that, for people we don't know, or work with non-physical beings. The ghosts are getting restless. So then we also need to be watchful for contact from the invisible worlds. And this kind of contact can come in the form of visions or messages or tests of various kinds to see how ready we are to deal with the work of helping the dead as invisible helpers. Now I say watch for contact instead of seeking it because it knows better when we're ready for it than we do. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned the idea of tests. One test is a test of readiness. So for example, if you hear a voice in your head and it scares you, that's the test. And you may need to know the difference between a voice that comes from a safe being and a voice that comes from a not safe being. So that becomes another kind of test. So here, I want to emphasize this phrase, self-remember. I'll explain it in a moment. Learn or self-remember how to travel and communicate within the invisible worlds. And we can do this through practice of meditation, dreams, and astral travel. Now, my experience in most of the theosophical books that I've read, and also in most discussion groups, is everyone always assumes that everyone in the audience is a beginner. And that may or may not be true. We may have had some experience, some exposure to these things in past lives. And all that's really needed is a trigger that helps us to self-remember what we already know deep down in our souls. So people always have these stories about self-remembering. They're in a library, a book falls off the shelf at their feet, and they pick the book up, and it's exactly the thing they need to know. It's the kind of information that comes to us in a really timely way that helps us understand who we are and our path in some better way than we did before. And then, from my perspective, it's really essential that we keep records of our experiences along these lines, because there's really no other way of knowing that we're developing or growing unless we can look at these records. So a dream journal or an occult diary. The difference for me is a dream journal is something that you write down in whether you have a normal dream or something really extraordinary. And an occult diary would be one that you write in only when you have some kind of mystical experience or out-of-body experience or lucid dream that you want to make sure that you remember, even if it's not a daily practice to write down your dreams. And then I think it's very important for us to be grateful for all encounters, you could say with visible and with invisible beings. In order to be grateful, though, we have to inquire into what they taught us about what we should be doing and what we should not be doing, but also what they've taught us about what we are and what we're not quite ready for, what we're ready for, what we're not quite ready for. So, in some cases, we can have an encounter that scares us, but not so badly that we want to drop out from this kind of experience. And usually it's just a matter of knowing better what's required of us. The reason that we feel scared is that we're in unfamiliar circumstances. And if we are patient and if we're open, we'll learn the lessons that we need to learn to take us to the next step. And then, instead of demanding that teachers come and help us, we just need to know that we'll attract them when we're ready, and that these teachers could be human, in other words, embodied, or non-human, probably not embodied, visible or invisible. In other words, as Annie Besant often said, the masters are on the lookout for anybody who's showing up in service, and they will provide you with the training that you need to take the step into invisible helper service if that's something that you're capable of doing, interested in doing, and as a result of the tests have shown yourself ready to learn. So at the point when you have the teachers, you can say that fully conscious cooperative work begins, because you can have a task or a mission assigned to you by some higher teacher, and you'll also experience help that comes for your own personally generated projects or initiatives. So these slides are a kind of baseline for what cooperative work means, and as I mentioned, they can be applied to just about anything. Continuing, keep climbing the ladder of oneness, because once you master one level of service, the level will start to expand into another higher, broader, more challenging level of service, or possibly into another higher body where you have to learn more about the senses and how to travel and how to understand and how to bring down to our physical waking consciousness what you experience at those levels. So our consciousness is constantly expanding, and that helps us to encompass whatever task or mission we're given. And we constantly challenge ourselves with more expansive intentions for the greater good. As we do that, we receive more help, visible and invisible, for realizing these intentions. And from my perspective, these are the only initiations that matter. I was engaged at dinner time in a conversation about initiations, and those of us who've read about that subject in Theosophical teachings know that there are 5 initiations until you become a master, and that there are another 5 after that that involves work with the occult hierarchy. And the question was, does it really matter if we know anything about the 6th through the 10th initiations? And my point was, not really. It's not something that's going to help us or guide us in our daily life. And even to some extent, there's a question about whether the initiations that we already do know about can help us. If, for example, someone feels that they've been initiated and tells someone else, that other person could also say, no, that's impossible. And then what? Or they can say something like, yes, I think that might be likely, and then your ego gets really big. Tim Boyd likes to tell the story about two Theosophists sitting down for breakfast one morning, and one of them says, I had the most amazing dream last night. It was the second initiation. And the other one says, I had the most amazing dream 2 years ago. It was the fourth initiation. So I personally think that we need to set that aside. It may be a helpful theoretical construct for some purposes, but in terms of guiding our own spiritual growth, I think there are a lot of pitfalls. However, it's always possible to tell that some kind of initiatory process is happening because you're given a larger realm to work in and you're given more abilities in order to meet whatever challenges come up when you're doing that. So, for example, I first started having experiences of working with the dead back in the late 1980s, so it's been a long time since I've been involved with that. And in the beginning, it was just going to the different areas that I could get to when I was out of body in my dreams, and then learning what I could about what their function was. And mostly I visited the astral levels of being where things are fairly simple. But later, I started visiting the higher levels of being in the afterlife and learning about those because I had developed the capacity to take that experience and turn it into words. That's the hardest part about all of this. Because each level you rise, each higher body you're experiencing, there's less time and space. There's less form. So everything that you do is a kind of translation from energy into words and images, from physical reality, just so you can tell someone else or even help yourself understand it. And so as your skill as a translator develops, you also are able to open up into ever higher realms. Probably there comes a point when you can't communicate anything sensibly. But I'm always trying to find the right way to do it. And oddly enough, the very best training is creative writing, like writing poetry, for example. Because if you're trying to write a poem, you're trying to communicate a feeling state or a consciousness state of your own so that someone else will understand it and relate to it. There's no difference between that and talking about a realm in the afterlife, except that the realm in the afterlife is not just a state of consciousness, it's not just a state of being, it's also a place, but it's a place outside of our usual experience. Just like you would maybe say about an unfamiliar fruit, that it tastes like a combination of orange and banana. Everybody who knows what an orange and a banana tastes like will understand that, and maybe get some impression of what the unknown fruit tastes like. So this is pretty much the way you have to work when you're working in the astral realms in order to make sense of what you experience and communicate it to others. So I want to start now with a few slides about work with the dying as visible helpers. Some people will feel called to do this. I know some of the people among my students who are also Theosophists, they've gotten training as a chaplain at divinity school so that they could go and work with the dead in the hospital or the dying in the hospital room. One of my students tells the story that she was sitting by the bedside of someone who was passing and the family was surrounding her, and she was very, very focused on what the person was feeling, and there was an angel in the room, and the angel slapped her on the knee and said, "Wake up and pay attention. There's more going on here than you're letting yourself see." So if you show up as a visible helper because you're not afraid of death and dying and you want to be in service for other people, then the realm to the other side, the opening to the other side can develop. So remember our four-part basic spiritual practice. We can think of this also in terms of working with the dying. The first element of this is show up. So what does that mean in this context? Show up in thought, feeling, and action. A lot of us are scared of death. A lot of us don't want to think about it. We don't want to have so-called bad feelings like grieving. We don't know what to do if a relative of ours is dying, or if someone close to someone that we know is dying, and the person that we know is in emotional trouble over it. So just to be present with the needs that are there, that's part of being a visible helper. And not just in thought, feeling, and action. That's kind of an inner practice that prepares you to actually be present in the same room at the bedside as that someone is passing. But it's also possible now to do it remotely by phone, Zoom, WhatsApp, email, text. In other words, whatever avenue is open to you, try to be present. And you can do it from anywhere simply by being in prayerful meditation. Now, having gone through this experience with my father, I have to say that any individual's death is a cosmic event. It affects all levels of being. It affects everybody present. It ripples out in all kinds of directions. And so it really is a stretch of consciousness to be able to be fully present for all of that, to embrace it, to learn from it, to feel what's needed, to take a step of some kind. And I recommend it. It's an excellent training in a lot of different realms. So think about it as a possible mode of service. And what being present in the way I'm talking about eventually leads to is being astrally present as an invisible helper. So I want to tell the story of what happened with my father. He was 89. He was diagnosed with a terminal cancer. He lasted for a number of months. Eventually what he died of was actually COVID. I couldn't visit him. He was 1,600 kilometers away. And all I could do was hear reports from my brothers and my sister and my mother. But when it was time for him to go into hospice, because he had only a few days or a few hours left to live, I was waiting for word from my family to let me know that he actually had arrived. And about 6 o'clock in the evening on that day, I suddenly had an impulse to lie down and listen to some music. So I put on some Bach piano music, and as I was listening to it, I was remembering that my father loved Bach piano music. Suddenly, it was as if a road opened up in my mind, and I was whooshing across the road, and I was by my father at his bedside in the hospice. My father was a very earth-centered person and somewhat controlling, and it seems like he was having a real hard time letting go to make the transition. So what I did was I wove around him a cocoon of unconditional love, which I saw as a kind of white light with rainbow hues in it, sort of like mother of pearl. And when I was finished with this process, I said, I think I'm done now. I was back in my body. I got up from listening to the music. It was now 40 minutes after 6. Half an hour later, I got a text message from my brother that my father had died, and I sent a text message back, when? And he said, between 6 o'clock and 6:40. So from that perspective, it was absolutely clear that I had been there. I've never done that before. I've done other related things, but this was the first time I ever had, this kind of validation. But it's after many years of practice, working with the dead on this side and on the other side, that something like that happened. It was an incredible gift for me, since I couldn't be there, and I believe it was that for my father too, because he couldn't let go. It was almost as if I was receiving him from where he was to the other side. And I've had many interactions with him since then. It's said in some Asian cultures that the last thought that you die with becomes the seed for your next lifetime. And probably usually that's a great happiness, or a great regret, or a great anger, or something of that nature. So I went to visit my father in the afterlife a week or two after he passed. And he was sitting in a room that was very like the room that he always was sitting in when I would be home. It would be what's called a man cave, with a big television and his gun collection and, things like that. So he was sitting there and he said to me, "I understand your brother's using my computer." And I said, yes. And he said, "Tell him to make sure he backs up everything so he doesn't lose any data." And I said, "This was your last thought when you died? What kind of lifetime does this lead to?" Anyway, I told my brother. He didn't quite know what to think of it, but he said to me that my father was obsessive about backing up his data, and that he had not only backups, but backups of the backups. And we both laughed about it, but I didn't know that about my dad. So it was kind of a funny moment of revelation. So in any case, working with the dead doesn't have to be dark. It can have its humorous side too, especially in a situation like this where you learn something unexpected and you have your own insight about it. And anyway, I keep visiting my father. I keep seeing how he's progressing through the afterlife, and that's all I can tell you about where he is now. I did spend a year following someone where I would attune myself to them every week over the course of a year. Somebody who had died tragically young, watching her progress through the afterlife, and I learned a lot from that. That was about 2 years ago. So in any case, if you have questions about these things when we get to the question part, I'm happy to talk more about them. So going on to our second aspect of the spiritual practice, how are we going to be fully present if we're involved with work with the dying? What's really needed is one pointed mind, just to be totally present, totally in service, and not lost in our cell phones, unless we need to go out of the room and take a break, to be undistracted. Because, pain and suffering and worry and fear, all of these deeply human emotions are present in the room, and we need to be aware of that, take care of ourselves in the midst of that, support others in the midst of that. It's a great test. It's a great test of spiritual strength. We have to be free of likes, dislikes, and judgments, and that includes not liking the fact that somebody that we love is in pain. We have to come to it with compassionate, comforting touch and silent understanding. Probably because of our reading about what happens in the afterlife, we can feel a little calmer, or maybe a lot calmer than most people, because we're Theosophists in the presence of death. But we can't preach about that in the moment that someone is passing. What we have to remember is everything we know about it is in our touch. It's in our calmness. All we have to do is just make contact with the person who's dying, and they can feel that. And they can take it in at a level where the mind doesn't fight with it. And then it becomes helpful for them as they take another step towards their transition. So, to be free of likes, dislikes, judgments, with compassionate, comforting touch and silent understanding in your knowledge of the transition process. And with gentle encouragement, stated or unstated, to let go into peace. My mother and my sister both have been interested in the work that I've done here and the books that I've published on it, and they kept telling my dad, look for Kurt, look for Kurt. Now, they met after he died, but I actually found him wandering around in my neighborhood out of body one night before he went into hospice. And he only ever came to visit me in Boston once. I moved there 40 years ago. And so he was lost on the street because he couldn't remember what my house looked like. And, I don't want to be angry at him for not coming to visit me. On the other hand, there's a certain karma where he's looking for me and he can't find me because he never came to visit me after that one time. So it's bittersweet humor, I guess I would call it, to look at something like that. And then our third element of the basic practice is be kind to yourself and others in the midst of this. Obviously, we have to practice self-care in the midst of our selfless service. It may not be good for anybody if we're 24 hours awake, 24 hours present for several days in a row. So we have to take breaks, and we have to work with other people. We may have to work in shifts with other family members. And we have to welcome everyone who's involved in any stage of the process with lots of hugs for support. And then, if we're there, which I couldn't really help with directly, we can collaboratively create a harmonious, peaceful, loving, appreciative environment with pictures, music, recordings, and stories. One of my brothers asked me what my father's favorite classical music was, so I was able to be there by his playing some of my recommendations. And especially we need to be in unconditional love and forgiveness for everyone involved. We may have more work to do after it's done, but while we're there, we have to be in this unconditional love and forgiveness space. And we can't take anything personally, because most people haven't thought deeply enough about death or what happens. As I mentioned, they're afraid. They turn their fear into anger because they're embarrassed about it, and then they take it out on somebody. And if you're the calm, quiet person, it's probably going to be you. So you can't take it personally. You just have to forgive them in advance, essentially, if they misbehave in any way. And then finally, is it possible to take this next step, which is taking a step in mutual joy? For me, each day with the dying is a step in perfecting our practice of what I call joyful, compassionate equanimity and service. So, we can do it at the supermarket. That takes a certain amount of mindfulness, but maybe not a lot of work. Can we do it in one of these high stress, high emotional situations? Again, it's a good test. We'll all experience it at some point, so we can be preparing ourselves not only for our own passing, but for the passing of the people that we love in following these 4 steps that I've talked about here. So you'll have to process your feelings. This is another problem in a lot of Western cultures. People don't want to talk about their inner life or their inner feelings, but if you don't empty it out, there won't be any room to let in the next day. And so I feel that talking about these things with someone who's not a blood relation to the person who's passed is more useful, because they have more of a grounded perspective outside of the situation. So a partner or friends, these are good people to rely on as support for your own self-care. And then, as I mentioned, forgiveness, but we often have to work at this. And the thing that we need to do, I think, this is my idea of the basis of forgiveness, is simply understanding that people didn't know another way to do what they did. If they did, they would have done it. It could have been better, it could have been worse. You got what they did, and it's a sign of their level of spiritual growth, their understanding of themselves, their understanding of the situation, their understanding of you. We can't take any of that personally. So it's important for us simply to understand that we need to forgive ourselves for those moments when we don't behave according to our own ideals. But there again, it's simply a matter of understanding we didn't know another way to do it until we did it, quote unquote, wrong. So the practice of self-forgiveness and forgiveness of others in all areas of life is really good preparation for working with people who've passed on. Often, the hardest people to forgive are our parents, because they never did it the way we would have liked it to have been done. And we have to accept we may be older souls than they are. And if that's the case, we've come into a family where they're really trying to do the best they can, and our expectations come from a more advanced understanding or level of being, and it's automatic that we'll be angry, but we have to forgive them because they're learning from us. I'm going to bet that almost everybody in this room has felt like they have been their parents' parent most of their life. So it just happens to be an occupational hazard of being an older soul that this occurs. So then there's this misunderstanding in most cultures about what grieving is. So I want to talk a little bit about that because we all experience it whether or not we're actually at the bedside of someone who's passing. And the most important thing is to understand that grief is not depression. Grief is actually a healing process. I think of it as a wave of energy that passes over us, and its purpose is to take up whatever we're ready to let go of and wash it out. But if we block it because we're afraid of depression, then that process stops and we're not able to empty, and then we fill up to the point where we become incapacitated in some way, possibly by depression. So the important thing is to learn to follow the wave when it picks you up, let it take you wherever it needs to go, create the space for it. Sometimes it's possible if you feel like it's too overwhelming or it's you don't know how long it's going to last, to take a piece of sad music that helps you cry and put that on, and then let yourself have the grieving experience for the length of that piece of music, and then move on to something else. So this is, I think, an important element of self-care with grieving. But then there needs to be a focus for the meditation, and that helps the cleaning process. And what I've developed for myself is this idea that we should meditate on what was that will never be again, so our memories of happy things, but we should also meditate on what could have been that never was. For example, my father and I didn't communicate much. He didn't see things my way, I didn't see things his way. If he picked up the telephone when I called, he handed it to my mother after he said hello. And sometimes he would talk about the weather, and then I would feel like we had a real conversation. That would happen maybe once a year on his birthday. So for me, I did have happy memories, but the grieving has to include what never was. So I have a friend that talks to his dad twice a week. Well, I would have liked to have had a dad like that, but I didn't. So I grieve when I'm thinking about my dad for what could have been that never was, and it helps me let go of that experience. Know that grieving is not merely accepting loss, but a cleansing and healing process that creates room for new inner and outer conditions, relations, and experiences. For those of us who have lost a parent really early, the thing that we need to understand is that many other people can be our parent. And in some case, they may be a better parent than the one that we lost. We can always love our parent for having brought us into the world and for whatever memories we have with them. But at the same time, we need to understand that we often need a spiritual mother or father, a mentor, someone who is about the same generation, who sees the possibilities in us, who supports that in some kind of unconditional love or some kind of support and training. And we need to accept that we have this spiritual parent in order to let go of the feeling of loss of the physical parent. So that ends my remarks on working with the dead. So my experience is that after someone has died, so this is from my own astral experiences, after someone has died, they're in a kind of holding zone. It often looks like a hospital room, and they're resting. And they're resting from all of the traumas that the physical body went through that can include any form of trying to bring them back. You know, if they flatline, as they call it, you know what I'm talking about. The drug doesn't necessarily interfere with the process in the way that you might expect. The last years of anyone are an opportunity for that person to empty out unexpressed emotion and unfulfilled desire. Because whatever is not emptied out, you will encounter in the astral realm, and that will be a part of your purging process in the astral realm. One of the reasons why people experience Alzheimer's or dementia is so that the ego is set aside, so that the pure emotions can express themselves through the body and be released, so they have a happier afterlife. So for someone who's done that work, the drugs really make no difference at all. For someone who's terrified of death or who doesn't want to experience the pain, they would have to unwind from the pain if they didn't have the drugs on the other side. But in the other way of thinking about it, the suffering of someone who's dying is usually a drama that is played out for the survivors, so they let go. You know, and so the person who is dying is already on the other side, and it doesn't matter what's happening with the body. The drama goes on until everyone feels they can finally let go. And then there are the people who don't believe there is any afterlife. For them, dying with a drug is perfect because there's nothing there, right? My uncle was like that, my father's brother, and when I found him in the afterlife, he was floating in this great sea of nothingness, thinking to myself, I'm dead, I know I'm dead, there's nothing here, I'm dead, over and over and over again, and at some point he'll wake up and say, oh, there's a self talking to itself. What is that? And then at that point someone can step forward and help. So you don't see the other side, and so you don't see that everything that happens on this side has a kind of perfection. I'll say this, for example, about suicide. If someone, let's say, jumps from a tall bridge with suicide, that person is allowed to experience every element of fear that is involved with that process, so that they will remember in their next lifetime not to do it and will be terribly afraid of high places. So, but someone who dies as the result of an accident, a car accident, they fly off a bridge, they go out of body so they don't have to experience that difficult transition. So there's a lot of, let's call it mercy, that's involved with this. We only see the messy side of it. Okay, another question. Well, everybody's path through the afterlife is different. I've known a couple of people who have committed suicide, and I've seen them on the other side, and it runs the gamut. For some, it is a genuine relief from all of the suffering they've experienced if they were deeply depressed for many, many years. However, there still is a stage of the afterlife where they would see all the good they could have done for others, and all the good they could have done for themselves, and all the good they could have received from others if they hadn't done that. And I would imagine that would be a very bittersweet experience. That it would make you sad to realize that you pulled yourself out and didn't really let in all of the help that was available. On the other hand, I know of someone who was so wound up in anxiety that part of his afterlife was literally running around in a circle to clear all of that energy out until the mind was empty and there was calm again. And then probably the saddest experience was I was in the afterlife, and there was a great flat place, and you could see the earth in the background as if you were on the moon, the big earth that we see sometimes in pictures from rockets and satellites. And there was a large group of young people, and it looked like they were participating in a rock concert, except the music wasn't happening. They had their blankets spread out, and they were all sitting and watching the earth. And I realized as I watched them that these were all the young people, let's say 24 years and under, who believed that the earth would destroy itself, and they had killed themselves because of that, and they were now sitting watching for the moment when the earth destroyed itself, so they could move on to the next step of their afterlife, because they had become so obsessed with that idea. So, as I mentioned, supposedly, the dying thought becomes the basis for a next lifetime, but it also seems to become the basis for the afterlife, too, especially if it's in any way an excessive thought. So that's the first part of your question. As far as comforting other people is concerned, the really hard part is to realize that any effort that we make in that direction may be trying to comfort ourselves because it's so hard to watch that person suffering, and that really the only thing we can do is just hold them in compassion and support them in their suffering and help them understand that we're there for them. Any kind of explanation, any kind of words, it seems to often come from the feeling of wanting me to feel better by trying to make someone else feel better, and they really need to be in their grieving process. Trying to explain why you think someone passed on. People have asked me that in counseling sessions. That's probably the hardest kind of work I have to do. And usually people aren't even ready for it until at least a year after someone has passed. Because it's possible to see the karmic causes for things like this, but people really don't want to know. Mostly they don't want to know. Even if it helps a little bit, because from their perspective, the death was completely unexplained. So that's a very tricky question. Sometimes spiritual seeking develops from that kind of loss, and if someone is in that place, we have a lot of help for them. But we don't offer it before they ask for it. I think that's the important thing. Along those lines, this is not one of my slides, but it could be. I think of compassion. True compassion is having 5 parts. And if we're not operating from all 5 parts, it isn't true compassion. So the first part is seeing where someone is. The second is understanding how they got there. The third is realizing the perfection of what they're experiencing given what they have to learn. The fourth one is not interfering in any way, even with information, unless they ask for it. And the final one is stop at the first sign of resistance. So you may understand everything about the afterlife. They'll let you say one sentence, and if they start resisting and you keep going, you're not being compassionate. So I'll include a slide in this presentation with those sayings on it, so you can be reminded. I don't know that can really be done, because what is our authority? I can speak with authority because I've been there, but does someone I'm speaking to believe that I have that authority because there's a place to go and a person can go there and it can be described? You can always say, in a book, it says this, but in another book, the Bible, it says something else, you see? So that's why I say the very best thing you can do is to be fully present with someone, touching them, not saying anything, so they feel that they're completely, unconditionally loved. There may be people who are open to the idea, but at that point they may be grabbing for anything that helps them not think about it, and that's still so fear-motivated that you can't really help with it. If you're not afraid, you give them permission not to be afraid. And if they ask you, why are you not afraid? Then maybe you can say something. With my father, I had a visit with him on the other side. He had just, his memorial service was a very joyful one for the family. He was really celebrated, and he had been there. And immediately afterwards, I went and visited him, and he was completely depressed. And I said, what's the matter? Well, he kind of messed up the family finances for a couple of years, and suddenly there was a danger that my mother wouldn't have a house to live in because the bank might take it away. And he just felt, they loved each other so much because they had met when they were 16 or 17 years old, and they're both 89, when he died. So they had long, long years together. He didn't feel like he had somehow done enough to honor his love for my mother, and he felt very guilty about it, and he was also afraid of judgment. And I said to him when we were in the afterlife, you're the only judge of your own life. We know that from the Idyll of the White Lotus. One of the 3 things in that book talk about that. You're the only judge of your own life, and you have as long as you need to look at all of the other options you could have taken if you had had the chance, which is one of the experiences we have in Devachan. Every ideal, every experience that we have, that we begin, and then for some reason the world blocks it out, that we have a chance to experience in Devachan fully realized as the basis for another lifetime. Well, the next time I looked on, he was fine. He took it in. But, not everybody can talk to somebody after they die and tell them, there really isn't a hell. So, that's a hard question. So think about karma in an unintelligent idea of karma. The person who assists the suicide has killed that person and then has to make it up karmically, even if their idea is mercy. And certainly some Christian teachings would be along similar lines, even though karma isn't a part of it. What I understand is that if you have a degenerative disease, there are lessons to learn from it. If you've learned those lessons, you're clear. If you haven't, they continue. If you cut off the process without having learned the lessons in this lifetime, let's say because you're afraid of pain, that can become the seed for another lifetime where you have to face pain and learn how not to be afraid of it. Or you might need to take on some of the same incapacities because you didn't learn all there was to be learned from them. There isn't really a hell in the traditional sense for someone who either assists or who passes on in that way. It's all about whether people have unfinished lessons. Someone could consciously choose to die in that way and complete all of the emotional and financial and spiritual work necessary to really embrace it. I don't think there could possibly be any karma for that. But I know, for example, that some people who have lifelong disabilities, it's a result of a previous lifetime in which they had all of the money, all the family connections, all of the training, the physical body, all of the things that would have made for a perfectly deep, richly fulfilling life, and they wasted it. And because they didn't love life, or they didn't love themselves, or other people didn't love them in the way they wanted to be loved, or they were lazy, or any of those things. And what happens is you end up choosing a body that is in some way disabled to regain your love and appreciation and gratitude for life, so that the next lifetime will be free again and you'll have another chance. So that's an example that I think can be useful guidance for this kind of situation. If you are asked, perhaps, to assist in someone's suicide, you have to look at your ethics, obviously. If you're of a scientific background and you're only interested in watching this as an experiment in human psychology, that has one karmic result. If you feel like it's a service that you're providing and you're providing emotional and spiritual support at the same time, there's another karmic result. Again, we only see the messy side of things, we don't see the karmic side of things, and the result is we have all of these strenuous arguments about ethical issues. the real ethics is where is the kindness being done? There's no kindness to oneself running away from our lessons, even if we think it'll free us from pain. But there's a larger mechanism that takes care of that educates us. Someone else? So, what we have to think about here is how strong is the will to be right about the end of the earth. If they want to justify the reason for their killing themselves as being that the earth was going to destroy itself anyway, and they didn't want to be here, then some part of them knows that's not true. Some part of them feels guilty for it, but there may be a will about having to be right, and that keeps them sitting, watching, waiting for it to happen. If I had watched for a long time, probably one by one they would disappear. Because at a certain point they would recognize it's boring. They would ask themselves a question, why am I here? They would let go of having to be right. And at that point, they would be transitioning into the actual afterlife instead of this holding pattern that they were in. So it's not a permanent thing, but it is based on how strong the will is. I didn't have a chance to ask anybody how long they had been there. So I can't really say anything about that. So did that answer your question? Help is always available, but you have to ask for it. And to use another example, in the United States, because people are so afraid of death, after they die, they refuse to admit that they're dead. And so there's a whole department of the afterlife that's involved in counseling them to accept that they're dead. And it's especially a problem for people who watch their funeral or memorial service, but it didn't take place in the way they imagined it, so they claim that it was a dream. It couldn't be real, it had to be a dream. And so because the guides on the other side can manipulate the astral reality, they create the funeral or memorial service so that it is exactly the way the person wanted it to be. All is a part of a process to help them let go of their claim that they are dead. So, there's something both tremendously sad and tremendously funny about that. My experience of learning about death from the perspective of the people who help out the dead has been a lot of this sort of bittersweet humor. Hopefully we laugh and we learn and we laugh and then we move on and remember. So we don't have that experience. So. Yeah, that's a good thought. That's something I probably should include in this talk. I will maybe add a slide about that too. Thank you. Any other questions or comments before we go on? Okay, so this is a chart where I talk a little bit about the different planes and levels and what you might encounter there in terms of beings with respect to the afterlife, and also the kind of workers who tend to show up for work at these levels. So we have a physical plane divided into a lower half, which is our material world. We have an upper physical plane called the etheric. It's less material, but it's still a part of the physical plane. And the lower level, we might end up with a ghost. An invisible helper is a person who's able to get out of body and travel to the other side and help the dead from there. And also sometimes help the living, but help the living without being in a physical body. So thank you for asking me. Okay, so ghosts are a big topic. Question is, what are they? I would say they're a manifestation on the physical plane to our normal or slightly altered waking consciousness And there may not be a being there. It may just be stuck energy of some kind that takes almost like a holographic form that we're able to perceive. But sometimes it's possible for people who don't really have a lot of mystical or spiritual or psychic experiences to see them. And sometimes it's possible for people who have some psychic training or psychic ability that they've developed to see them. The invisible helpers are the people who are more trained. So the distinction I'm making between psychics and invisible helpers is a natural psychic versus someone who has training of some kind. Gray zone souls requires a little bit of explanation. The term comes from a book called The Gray World by Evelyn Underhill. She was a mystic who wrote a lot about mysticism and was very famous in the early 20th century. And it's a novel, and it's kind of a depressing novel, although I think that's its point. It's about the people who end up stuck between physical and non-physical reality. They're not able to come back to the body because the body is dead, the physical body. And they're not able to move to the other side for some reason, resistance or fear or lack of understanding or clinging to the physical world. And so she's writing about a young person, a young female natural psychic who's able to see them and wants to understand where they are and why they're there and what can be done to help them, if anything. And so there are a lot of training courses in how to help people make the transition out of that stuckness, out of that being a kind of lost soul in the gray zone. Typically you'll hear New Age people say, I just tell them to go into the light. Okay, that was easy. Sometimes, they're saying, oh yeah, he was over there for 600 years and he was a pirate and I just told him, go into the light. Okay, there's a lot of information there, 600 years ago, and pirate, and stuck in the gray zone. And was the soul really there, or was that just an image? Or anyway, that's why being an invisible helper is getting some training about that is helpful. You can make more intelligent assessments of what you're experiencing. So we also have an astral plane. The Theosophical books don't really talk about it being divided into a lower half and an upper half, but I think it's possible to do that. I'm calling the beings in the lower half catharsis souls. Catharsis is a Latin-based word for purging. They're the ones who are experiencing a kind of purgatory, or purgatory, if you want to think about it that way. They're emptying out their unfulfilled desires, their negative emotions, unexpressed emotions. And it can have a hellish feel to it because it's very, very intense. And the interesting thing about my experience in non-physical reality is if experience is too intense for us, we experience it as heat. So I think that's the basis of why the hellfire is talked about. On the other hand, if for some reason we're understimulated, we'll feel cold. So it's just one of the things that happens over there. Pupils and disciples, this refers to higher levels of training as an invisible helper. A pupil is someone who has been taken on as a mentee, someone to be mentored by what we would call an initiate or a more advanced soul, possibly even a master. A disciple is genuinely connected with a master. These invisible teachers come in all different grades. They can show up for us at any stage we need to learn something. Sometimes there can be a lifelong relationship. I have an especially close relationship right now with an invisible teacher that I call WG. WG stands for wise guy because he's very wise, but he's also very funny. He's really great whenever I'm caught up in some kind of ego-based illusion. He's got a sword and he just cuts through it and makes me laugh while he does it. And he's a somewhat more advanced student than I am. He's not a master, but his level of understanding of these things can feel to me like it's that of a master because there's so much. He's been working with me for several years. He shows up in my dreams. That's how we work together. I have other teachers that have showed up at different times for different kinds of lessons. Calling them pupils or initiates or masters, I think, is kind of a distraction. So I just refer to them as invisible teachers. So at the higher level of the astral plane, we're likely to encounter what I'm calling religious souls. We'll see in Leland's books about the astral plane and Devachan. He talks about these ever upper levels as being, quote, sectarian heavens, unquote. So sectarian means some established religion that has certain beliefs and certain limitations and certain conventions and traditions, and they tell you what your afterlife is going to be like, and the classic Christian version of that is everyone's floating or has wings and they're wearing white robes, they're playing harps, and no one thinks about whether that will get boring after 3,000 years. So anyway, those heavens are all on the astral plane, and their purpose is sort of like what I was talking about with my uncle. How long will it take for them to get tired of that and ask themselves what's next? And then they can move on to another level where they'll get education in, I'll get to that when I get to the mental plane. They'll get education in the steps that lead eventually to reincarnation. But meanwhile, they're going to live it up, go to church and play golf, because reincarnation doesn't occur in their belief system. So on the lower mental plane, I'm classifying these souls as learning souls. This is the stage at which something I call the deep life review occurs. We all see this in movies, your life flashes before your eyes, you see all of these things. There's a very funny movie called Defending Your Life that is about what it's like to have this deep life review. It's an old movie. I think it was made before some of you were born, but very well worth seeing sometime, because it's very funny, and its vision of the afterlife is very theosophically informed. So the learning souls are the ones who are going through every moment of their life and seeing whether it's aligned or misaligned with their soul's plan for their growth. And whatever is aligned, that becomes something they know that they can carry with them into a future lifetime. And whatever was misaligned, that becomes a basis for some karmic lesson or some situation that will give them an opportunity to come up with a better solution. And disciples and initiates, or that level, can be helpful guides to people who are in that deep life review process. And then at the upper mental or causal level of being, we've got the souls who are returning to life. So the first person that I tracked through the afterlife was my uncle. He died 20 or 25 years ago. He was an engineer. I told the story of how he ended up in a place where there was nothing. Eventually, after almost 10 years, he ended up in the place where he was talking to a guide about, or a teacher about, what his next lifetime would be like. And there's a little bit of a lesson about karma here. He would never speak about his feelings. And just before he died, he had a stroke. So he knew he was dying, but he couldn't speak. And so he had this frustrated experience of wanting to say, "I love you," and not being able to do it. So that was his dying thought, and that was becoming the basis of his next lifetime. So I called what I experienced a future life screening room. It was like seeing a movie of some elements of what your future life would be like. So he had moved to the western part of the United States when he was an older man in this life, before he died. And he loved it out there, so he wanted to come back as a young man who would have, as a male, so that he could become a young man who had adventuresome experiences in mountains and rivers and so on. But the guide said to him, "You have to learn to speak about your feelings. So you'll become depressed if you don't. The depression will always alleviate if you speak about your feelings. So remember that, because that will be what helps you through your life." And my uncle got this horribly upset look on his face. And he said, "You have no mercy." because his karmic lesson was he had to learn how to speak about his feelings. So, again, bittersweet humor, I guess. So, future life screening room. And that's as far as I'm going to go with this chart, because the beings that are involved in the higher levels aren't involved in life and death in the same way that we are. So there's nothing more to be said there. So again, adopting the template that we began with, where I talked about the things that we can do to prepare ourselves to be of service in some way, we could develop an intention to adopt an attitude of service with respect to the dead. Oops, something like this. May I become an invisible helper for anyone, living or dead, who is caught up in the cosmic drama of passage into and through the afterlife. If that intention appeals to you, make up some version of it. It doesn't have to be English, that you can say to yourself as an intention when you're falling asleep, and watch what develops after that. It may be that some training begins, and you're tested, as I mentioned, for how ready you are for these kinds of experiences. Then you'll have to prepare yourself by studying what is required to become an effective invisible helper. Leadbeater's book called Invisible Helpers can be very good for that. So this means understanding the transition process, possibly learning about astral projection, studying near-death experiences, studying world beliefs about the afterlife, and what we were talking about at the beginning, how to be of assistance to the living, dying, and the dead. Climbing the ladder of oneness. Again, keep a daily dream or occult journal. Record your inner and outer experiences connected to the passing of beloved animals and humans. If you have a dream shortly after someone dies of that person, don't keep asking yourself the question whether it was real or not. Just assume it was a real experience. You may or may not be right, but the fact that you stopped asking the question will make it easier to have real experiences, because that doubt will constantly tune us out without our realizing it, no matter how much we might want to be an invisible helper. So we have to develop a state of fearless, deeply compassionate equanimity when we do this work. When we're called, we can practice visible and invisible helping for survivors and those who have transitioned. What are typical invisible helper tasks? Providing comfort to the living, welcoming the dead to the other side, orienting the dead to their new abilities and conditions. I like to think of that as being a social worker in the afterlife. You know, you might have a little group, like a self-help group that you're helping adjust to the conditions of the afterlife. Guiding the dead from realm to realm as required, and relaying reports and messages to the living. This is something I've experienced too. Maybe I'll talk about it in the twilight. The important thing that I want to point out here is it's usually the seers who do this work, because they're the ones who have the ease and fluency of traveling between the realms. CWL, Leadbeater, had this to say about invisible helper training. You need single-mindedness in useful work, so you can practice that on the physical plane. You need self-control of what he calls nerve, desire, and mind. We might say about nerve that it's not being afraid. He talks about the tests of earth, water, air, and fire. How many of us have had a dream of breathing underwater, or moving through a wall of flame or a wall of earth? According to Leadbeater, these are tests to see whether we're ready for training as an invisible helper, to see whether we are so caught up in the idea of having an earth body, physical body, that we don't realize we can move through earth when we're not in that body. We're not affected by falling off a cliff. We're not burned by fire. We don't drown in water. So you show yourself as trainable when you pass these tests. If you're only afraid, or you wake yourself up, or if you feel like it's a nightmare, then you haven't gotten very far. Although, if you notice and you just accept it, that's a little better. But it's even better to realize that you're out of body, and then you become lucid, and then training becomes possible. Calmness, in other words, absence of worry and depression in this kind of work. Knowledge of how the astral body works and the kinds of things you might experience on the astral plane. coming in with unselfishness, not being vain, proud, and resentful about these experiences. Some people are resentful. They don't like the idea that they get whisked away from their body at night to help the dead. Too bad for them, right? And we have to express love, striving to be a channel of divine love. The words that are not in parentheses are Lead Leader's words. The words that are in parentheses are my interpretation of those words. Here's what Annie Besant had to say on invisible helpers. I have met many a man, many a woman who is anxious to be an invisible helper, that is, a worker on the astral plane. But I do not always find that those people are visible helpers as far as their present powers go. And I do not understand why people should want to go about in astral slums when they keep carefully away from the physical slums which are already within their reach. So her teaching there is, we do our work of service in the world, and if we develop that talent for being an invisible helper, it just shows up as the next step in our service. If it doesn't show up, we probably have more work to do in service on the physical plane. I'm going to stop there because the subject of the lightning rod effect is something that we need to talk about in a little more detail than we have time for. So let's break for lunch, and then I'll finish this part of the talk after lunch.